Well, I'd like to welcome everyone here today to another class from the BYU Library Family History Center. We're going to talk today about using historic topographical maps to find cemeteries and churches. So, well, we'll find a lot more besides cemeteries and churches, but I just wanted to use those two you know, those are the things I think people are looking for the most when they get on these old maps. So, the first issue, of course, that we have to go through is unless you happen to have kind of the same kind of background that I have, which would be a little bit unusual, I'm sure. From the time that I was as young as old enough to just barely read, I was probably old enough to start using maps. And I've been using maps ever since that I was that very young. And the whole idea of topographical maps was not just difficult or different for me, but it was just like, yeah, well, that's kind of how you get around. You just get one of these maps and it'll tell you exactly where you are and how to go where you need to go. So this was long, of course, long before computers, long before the internet, long before satellites. And these were primarily the things that we would use to orient ourselves. So when I was trying to find something, a place, for example, an example would be a rock that my great grandfather carved his name into in northern Arizona. I would go to the library and they had big flat drawers full of topographical maps, and I would pull out the maps and start going through to see if I could find the location of the places that were mentioned in the literature about my great grandfather coming across northern Arizona in the 1870s. And basically, it's a hand drawn representation of the Earth's surface that provides detailed information about the shape, elevation, and features of the terrain. Now, this is interesting because now we can look at satellite views. If you go to Google Maps, you can go into the satellite view. And then from the satellite view, you can zoom in and look down at people's houses and you can see all of the mountains and land. But what's not missing from that, unless you aren't aware, you think there's an awful lot of information here on these Google Maps. But what's missing is all this information that you're seeing here on a topographical map that's on this screenshot. Because basically it's telling me the elevation of each of the little lines, and it's telling me, showing me all the little creeks and all the marshes and washes, and it's showing all the different, and it's identifying those things. All the hills that actually have names are named, and the amount of information on a topographical map far exceeds normally what you would be looking for on a satellite view. So when you're looking at a satellite view, you're really missing a lot of this information. So these are hardly what you would call out of date or not useful anymore because they record over more than 100 years of information about the way that the land was developed and the property and the towns and geographic features. So they're incredibly informative and give you tons of information. They were invented. The idea of doing contour lines was an invention, and they wanted to do. This Charles Hutton wanted to show how he did a survey of the Schiehallion Peak in 1774. So they go long ways back. Every square inch of the United States has been mapped by topographical maps long before the internet came along. There were topographical maps of every part of the United States, complete. And they were renewed and updated periodically year after year. And so what you're going to see is a whole sequence of maps. And the viewers and way we have of looking at those maps now obviously is tremendously more convenient than trying to use the big flat paper maps out on tables in a library, trying to figure out which map was next and and get all the adjoining maps. So you ran off onto to the next map. I don't want to diminish the value of learning how to use all of the features on Google Maps and on Google Earth, which I think is another extremely valuable way of looking at information. Now, just to tie this to genealogy directly, then, so what does this mean for a genealogist? So the first thing that I do, if someone comes in and asks me a question, I have about 2 or 3 questions back. And no matter what it is that they're starting to ask me, those 3 questions are always the same. When they start telling me about their great great grandfather or their great great grandmother or their great 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 grandmother or whatever, my first question is, what time frame are we talking about? Now, these aren't in any particular order because I just kind of vary the order from this depending, but they're always asked. And then I get a time frame. And if the time frame is within a certain range, then I know pretty much what I'm beginning to have to do about. And the second question, obviously, could be the first question, is where are we talking about? What place are we talking about? And if they say, oh, well, and sometimes it's more common than not, since I do a tremendous amount of high percentage of immigration questions over the last 2 or 3 years or more, is they haven't a clue. They have no idea. They'll tell me, oh, it's Germany, or it's they came from Hungary, or they came from England, or, and that's it. So now we're into what we could determine that's what I need to know to start. So I say, okay, so now we need to get some more specific information. And if we have a computer, and I'm not just answering these questions kind of randomly by people, the first thing I do is I say, well, let's go look at these places and see what we're talking about here. And so I go into Google Maps and I put in the place where they say that people came from, and we have a look at it. And it could be a tiny little dot of a place up in the tops of the mountains in the middle of Mexico or Ecuador or Peru, or it could be a major city, or it could be someplace in Eastern Europe. Any one of these places that all the different places where I have a tendency to have people ask questions about. So now, what do I have? Now I have a visual. I can see, and by using Google's Street View, I can go down and look the streets, right down to the street level. But here's the key here. This doesn't tell me historic information. It doesn't give me what it looked like 100 years before, or what kinds of information were recorded at that time. So that's the difference. That's why we're going into these. So because we have a tremendous amount of data and every place on the Earth mapped, we sometimes kind of not give very much benefit to historic records. And they discount, a lot of people discount it and say, well, it's all obsolete. It doesn't, it's not what it looks like today, or I can't use it. All those roads aren't there, the railroad's not there anymore, da 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 da. Well, yeah, that's true. But what we're doing now is historical research, and we want to know what it was like at the time that the people were there on the ground. And there's some other things. Now, I've chosen in this particular presentation to highlight cemeteries and churches. So there's the reason for that. First of all, cemeteries become an actual physical location where some event occurred. That's where they were buried, where their family was buried. And that gives you a fixed place to start to do some research from. So cemeteries are always great. And churches, because so many people I ask today, and I say, well, you're talking to me about your great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather. What was their religion? What church did they go to? And they have no idea. And why are these both good? Well, because there's burial records, there's mortuary records, there's all sorts of records having to do with cemeteries. And Church records are also important because if you get back before we have very many birth, death, and marriage certificates in our society, which disappear mostly from the United States about 1850, except along the eastern coast of the United States. So basically, there's ways we have to do it to determine how and where people lived. Now, this is the key. This is what we're looking at right here, is the Historical Topographical Map website from the USGS. And what I say about the USGS is advise that don't start looking for the website. Don't go to usgs.gov and start looking for things. This is a massively wide-ranging website. It is absolutely enormous. And believe me, it is very, very, very difficult, and it's not organized at all. It is just one huge pile of websites of different subjects. So use a search, put in historical topographic maps, and it will get you right here to this page. This is still not going to be a big help because there's more information here than you need in order to do what I have, show you how to do today. But what we want to end up looking at is the National Maps Historic Topographical Map Collection. The maps start between 1884 and 2006. Now, there are maps that go back earlier than that, and they can be found. And this will get you into the scheme of looking at lots of other maps that have been drawn by and large. But the advantage of topographical maps in this collection is that they were constantly updated. And so we have a series of maps from around the 1880s up to the present of most of the places in what are in the United States today. So this is a very important collection. So you need to remember that genealogy is history and history is genealogy. And that as long as we're finding historical things, that's probably going to help you find more information about your ancestors. We have a tendency to think that we've run out of information once we can't find anything more in a genealogy website or a genealogical collection. And the answer is history and genealogy is history. And there's all sorts of records that don't come labeled genealogy that are going to be helpful. Topographical maps are one of them. There's nothing in these websites on topo maps or other maps that talks about genealogy, but they're all extremely useful and helpful. So here we have the topo view from the USGS. This is part of that website that I showed you just a moment ago. And it will let you zoom in and start finding maps. But the more important thing is to understand something about these maps before you even start to get into them. This is a topographical map sheet. This is the way they are published over the years. And if you could see the small print on it, you would find out that there is a companion map. There are companion maps to this map to the north, south, east, and west. So this particular map has a title. It is one map. And that map title, the system of it continues with all the maps around the outer edge of this. So there's 4 additional maps, and every map has 4 more maps. So as you move across the country, if you run up to the edge of this map, then you're going to be looking for the next map that's in this particular section. This one happens to be Massachusetts Commission of Waterways and Public Lands from 1917. So it can be considered to be a fairly detailed map. And you're going to see a lot of information about not just the waterways, but about the buildings and roads and towns and things that were in existence back there in 1917. So here's the heading on the map. You can see it's a USGS map, It has a partial revision by Massachusetts Commission on Waterways in 1917. That means there's another map out there that this is a revised map of. And this is the Massachusetts Worcester sheet. Okay, so this is the identity of this particular sheet. That name is how you would go about finding this map if you were looking for the paper maps in a library. And they would be put together as they pile through. So you would be doing that. And then you would look around this map and it would tell you what all four other maps were, how they were located. Now, of course, there are going to be times when there aren't four maps. If the map runs into the ocean or if it runs into a large lake or something, they may not have any more a map on that type of that end of the map, obviously. This is the bottom part of the map, and it tells who did the map. And it also has, if you could read it, it would have the adjacent map. And it tells you what the contour lines are and interval bases. So all those little squiggly lines are showing you the elevation of the property, of the land. So when they're closer together, the land is it's a steep slope. When they're farther apart, it's a flatter area or not such steep slope. When you see a dark brown thing with lines all real close together, that means that there may be a cliff or even a very steep hill. But by zooming in on this, you'll see that there are elevation marks on every one of the lines. At some point, there's about every 5 to 10 of these lines, they'll have an elevation. Sometimes the elevation will be on every line, but it basically tells you which line. Now, I can look on a topo map of Provo, Utah, that includes my property here in Provo, where I live. And I can look at the topo map and I can tell exactly my altitude above sea level. And it happens to be on the 5,000 foot level, period. The line that runs practically through my house is 5,000 feet above sea level. So let's kind of move along here and see how we're going to see about these elevation lines. And why would you want to know all this? Well, first of all, looking at a topo map is utterly confusing until you begin to sort out all of this different kind of information. And it takes some time and it takes some effort. But the reward is that you've gained a lot more information about the places that are important for your ancestors than you would have had otherwise. Because that's not the kind of information you're normally going to get from books or from any other old documents or anything else. And what's going to be really interesting is when your ancestors start talking about places and you meet mentions of places in their journals or letters or whatever out. And there was one place, some of my family, my four grandparents all lived in the same town at one point or another. And the town they refer to as a place where my grandfather lived with my grandmother and just when they got married, and they called it the Slough. Well, slough is a word. It means a wet place or a marshy area. And it's spelled Slaughh. And that's what I was looking for. I could not find that on the map. And what I found out finally, and how I worked out through that, was the place they were referred to sounded like Slough, but what they were saying was salado, which is a Spanish word for salt, a salty place. Well, that was specifically really important because that was on the topographical map, the salado. And so that's where they lived. And that's easy to find. It was just about a mile or two south of St. John's where they were living. So each line on each of these maps is at a specific location. And all of the lines close. In other words, they go around and they outline an area of the ground. and they never cross. And so every single point that has that same elevation is along that line. So as you watch the contour lines, you'll see the elevation change. And every fifth contour line is bolded and labeled. Well, this is the main rule, but you'll see differences. They'll sometimes be every 10 feet. Sometimes you'll be looking really hard to find the label on your contour line. And the distance in elevation could be as little as 20 feet or as high as much as 100 feet. And so you need to know that for sure, because when these lines are all close together, that means the ground is very steep. And it's a great big difference if each one of those lines is 100 feet as opposed to 20 feet, because the 100 feet lines are going to be straight up and down like a cliff instead of just a steep hill. Now, another thing that's important is that the topographical maps use colors to represent different features. So you'll see green is vegetation, blue are water bodies, pretty obvious that. Yellow is cultivable land, white is uncultivable land, brown are sand features, contour lines, and elevation numbers. So everything else is in brown. And black is dry streams, ponds, roads, trails, man-made cultural features. And red is densely built-up areas, settlements and surveying features. And what the referral here is to the U.S. Public Land Survey. The U.S. Public Land Survey is the way that all of the land from Ohio west was surveyed in the United States. And so it's all squared land with straight sides and rectangles. So if you think of the Public Land Survey as rectangles, and you think of the meets and bounds property lines that were popular in the eastern part of the United States, they are all just going from trees to houses to whatever, and Public Land Survey is just sort of an abstract. It's a grid laid on the whole country. And then purple is used for when they made a revision to the map using aerial photos. So you'll see these colors on the map, and they do mean something. There's a blow up. First of all, on the right-hand side, there's a long piece of a document that shows a large number of the topographical symbols and legend. And it's a good idea to get an idea of what all those little marks may mean. And this kind of a document will show that kind of mark. And when you're talking about these, you say, well, where was this? Where do you get this? And the answer is we look it up on the computer. You do exactly what I did. I typed in topographical map symbols, and I get a copy of this. So we use the words to find the documents. I'm not great on URLs, meaning the addresses that are used on the internet, because first of all, I can't ever remember them. And secondly, because I don't need them. I can find them either through doing searches by searching by the words faster than I can recall, or looking up some address that I wrote down or had someplace. So this is the simple way to get to all this information, is just start looking for topographical maps symbols. So now this is into the viewer, okay? And on the right-hand side of the USGS view, topo view, you'll see a list of the years and the topographical maps for each of the different versions of the maps that were available. And there's a slider bar that lets you go through the list, through the different maps, and you can go by location, you can go by do lots. You play around with this. It's pretty interesting to have that kind of information. So what we have in the present is one of the latest maps. In other words, the one that I have the screenshot of, that's the map, is the one that's the latest. And you'll see that one has Interstate 40 on it, and it has the railroad on it, and lots of different information. And then the roads that are available. And this happens to be a little tiny town in northern Arizona called Joseph City. It's where my great grandparents came from. My great Tanner family came from. So I could go on the right hand side and starting with the 1886 Holbrook map, I could come down until I hit some Joseph City maps, but they would all be the same view, particular not exactly the same coverage, but they would all be focused on this one part of Arizona. So you can see all the series of maps that are there. Now, why is this important? It's because over time, churches and cemeteries, particularly, and other businesses that are there have a tendency to be abandoned and not be marked anymore because they're no longer used. And so when you go back into one of these topographical maps historically, back in time, you're liable to find the location of a cemetery or a church that's no longer physically there and not even available on your Google satellite view. You may have to look really carefully to see it. The rule here for doing any kind of genealogical research is that you need to know a precise location of an event in an ancestor's life. Sometimes it doesn't mean that you need to know that in advance. So, for example, you could look for and find your ancestor in a census record. The census record's main thing, besides giving you a little bit of information about the ancestor and his or her family, is that it gives you an exact location where that person was living at the time that census record was taken. So now you have a precise location to begin doing some research and finding records, all of which are organized geographically. So we have all of this information here is going to help us find additional information about our ancestors. And when you know the precise location, then you have the opportunity to go look for old topo maps, because you're going to find that all of that information that you need to know is around on the topo map. So now here's a zoom in to see the detail. So here you can see something that's pretty important, because on this particular map, that's June 1888, you see the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. And if you follow the railroad off to the left on the map, you'll see it ends. So this map was drawn just after the railroad passed through St. Joseph at that time, now Joseph City, and Holbrook, and all over it. And one thing also you're going to see from this map is the blue little wiggly line that ends too, and that's the Little Colorado River. Now, we would need to look at additional maps to see if the railroad actually went any further at that time, or to find when the railroad was finally. Also look up and see how online and see when and how the railroad was made. So why would that make a big difference? Well, that's because until that railroad came through, these people were completely isolated from the world as far as distance, time, and where you could get from any place else. And once that railroad came, there were jobs, there was ability to travel fairly quickly to different locations, instead of spending a full day and night to go to the adjacent towns for supplies or whatever was needed. Then they had a way to go quickly from place to place. So now we're bringing it closer to the present, and we're going to see that there's even more information. And now you're seeing the color coding that I talked about. And in this case, there's all the different washes, meaning dry, perennially filled places. If it rains, there was water. If it didn't rain, there was no water. And you'll notice too, that's interesting, is that there's every windmill that's available is marked. The corrals are marked, and all the other information is here on the map. Now, since there isn't some kind of way you can type in a thing and have somebody find that information for you, you have to go through and look carefully at the map and see what information is available. And here's again the list of the various maps that are available for this particular location. One of the things that we would look for, by the way, is something that's located down on the extreme left bottom of this particular screenshot. And it says numerous potholes. The reason why we were interested in this in that would be because when I was young, we would do a lot of cave exploring around Arizona, and we would comb through these maps to find the caves which otherwise were unmarked. And finding something that said numerous potholes immediately got our interest in going out there and finding out if there were caves associated with those potholes. Now, here's where it gets the technical part of it, because now we have the map, and there are some views that can be saved of the maps. When you're looking at a map, you can save a copy of that map off for your own use. And in this case, what you're going to do is look for what's called the KMZ view of the map. And the KMZ view is what helps the KMZ is that it opens in Google Earth. That means that this map then becomes an overlay. So all the information that's sitting here on this map is going to show up on Google Earth. And then you'll have this topographical map with all of its information, and then all of the information that's already on the Google satellite view of this particular spot. And the programmed, because of the way this happens, is when you open up the KMZ view, it has the information to position the map exactly on the Google Earth satellite view. And if you're interested, we're not going to start now to look for some of the information that's on this map. And you'll see kind of in the lower right-hand side of the map, you'll see a cemetery mark. And that's the cemetery for Joseph City. And then there's another up that road along the freeway that's shown as kind of an overlay is the old Ford Historical Monument. In other words, that's where the original fort was located when they did the settlement. So here's the cemetery. Now I'm going to switch away from Joseph City, and we're going to take a look at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And this is going to start with the 1916 map. Now, on this 1916 map, there is already a cemetery. Now, we would like to see an older cemetery, and there's one down south right at the edge of the map also. So there's two cemeteries on this view, and you may have to search a little bit around to see where those cemeteries are. But why would you be interested in a Murfreesboro cemetery? Well, if you look over on the right-hand side of this screenshot that I have here, you'll see there's a place called Shiloh. And if Murfreesboro and Shiloh don't mean anything to you, that means you need to start learning a little bit about your U.S. Civil War history, because this was the site of some of the biggest battles in the Civil War. And why would these cemeteries be important? It's because of all the people that died in the Civil War. So there may be Civil War veterans that were buried in these cemeteries around this area. And another thing is there's this little symbol, which is a cross, that is a Roman cross, and this is for a church. So now we have a church. So how are we going to find these today? Well, technically, we could be able to drive in and follow the same road pattern as there is today, but you're not going to get all the benefit of all the traffic and everything else. So now we have to get an overlay of the old features as they appear on the satellite view by putting the KMC file on top of or opening it in Google Earth, and it'll be there on exactly where it is on the face of the Earth. So here we have on the left-hand side, we have the current satellite view. And then on the right-hand side, we have the old cemeteries marked. Now, the question is, where is the cemetery on the satellite view? Because there doesn't appear to be anything particularly that marks a cemetery. So we overlay the map on it, and then we can see fairly accurately. And basically, you can change the opacity of each of the maps. You can make it more opaque or more or less opaque. And so you can see the features on both maps sort of in going back and forth to see where everything is. And you'll also see on the overlay, there are a lot of the churches that are identified on the satellite view from Google's Maps. So now you go to the street view or the actual up close view. This is part of Google Maps. And if you zoom in on that, where that cemetery was located, you can see that the cemetery still exists. It's not necessarily marked so much as a cemetery as it is just appearing in between some houses and businesses that are in that area. So there may not be anything on the level of the town. If you were driving around town, you may not be able to find it because it may not be marked and may not be very visible. But so here's the old cemetery. And if you do a very close up of that, you can see some of the little more detail of the grave markers. This is using Google Earth, and I'll go back to that again. The KMC maps are files that will open up in Google Earth and overlay over the satellite view.
James, I have a question for you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
This is from Tanya B. She says, do cemeteries ever move? I'm talking about very old cemeteries in Scotland.
The answer is yes, they do move. I have an extreme example in my case, in one of my ancestors who was in Philadelphia. The mystery was that he died in like 1855, and the cemetery and where he was buried and his grave marker showed, and the cemetery record showed that it wasn't buried in that cemetery until like 1870. And I thought, well, what do they do? Keep him around in the living room or something for 20 years? But what actually happened is that he was buried in the Fourth Presbyterian Cemetery in downtown Philadelphia, and they dug up the bodies and moved them all. So yeah, it happens when sometimes the progress of the construction in the downtown areas were such that they would move cemeteries. So yeah, sorry, but it does happen. That's why it's helpful to have the older maps you could get. In England, you have these high detailed maps from the mid 1850s. They're called ordnance maps. Yes, the question about KMC files, that's what they are. They automatically reference on Google Earth. So you don't have to do it manually. You just open it up and there's the map overlaid. There's the file open up. It can actually be opened up from Google Earth. So they're very, very helpful. And here's, if you zoom in, you can see the difference between the topographical map information and the satellite view information. Okay, so now we're going to look at a different place that's not quite so well known or quite so in the middle of famous battles in the Civil War. And this is a mining town called Ophir. Ophir's an old name from the gem world. You probably recognize it as back at the biblical times. But here it was the name of a mine in north central Utah. And you can see here from the topo map, there's some information, but if we get into a satellite view, we can see that this is what it looks like today in that same little canyon. So here's a satellite view of what's there. And so it's obvious there's a bit of construction and things happened. So the Ophir map is 1885, and the satellite view map, of course, is 2023. That was the date that they took the satellite image for Google Maps. So this is a Google Maps image. So here's a Google Maps of 2024. If you just zoom in on Ophir and look at what it looks like is available. Now, if you're looking for either a church or a cemetery at this point, it's going to be interesting because the Ophir mine was open for quite a long time, but is now completely abandoned. And it could be categorized as a ghost town, but it's not a ghost town because some people have bought land up there and are living up in there. So it's just a place where people live up the canyons in Arizona. So here's what it would look like if you were on the street level. You can see the old mine construction and tailings where they would be dumping stuff and building retaining walls so they could build the roads. So now, if you go out a ways on its topographical map, you'll find out that Ophir had two cemeteries. They have the Ophir New Cemetery and the Ophir Old Cemetery. Now, what's interesting on these is another thing you can do, and this is just mentioning this, is that you can go to the big cemetery websites like Find a Grave and Billion Graves. So there's two. It's possible that some of these older cemeteries have not been surveyed, and they will not have the information. So one thing you're going to be doing is doing some additional research to find out who was buried in the Ophir Old Cemetery, if you're looking for this. And this is just an example, and it has come up on all the way across the United States. I've done this in Georgia, I've done it in Tennessee and Kentucky and North South Carolina, and it doesn't matter the state. When you're getting into this information about the churches as they existed years ago and how they're existing now, then you'll find that this is when these maps become extremely valuable. So if I do Ophir Cemetery on Google Maps, it'll pull it up. It sticks it out there in the middle of nowhere. If I do a satellite view, I can almost see the boundary of the cemetery, but it does not show the old cemetery. Actually, if you stare at it long enough, you can see the old cemetery also, but it's pretty hard to see from this satellite view. But once you know it's there, then you can use the satellite view to drive over there and look at it. And now here's another example of some more cemetery issues. This is the Arizona, New Mexico Nutrioso quadrangle. Why it says that is because this town, Nutrioso, is only about 10 miles from the New Mexico line. So this map actually shows a portion of New Mexico and Arizona, and there's the boundary line between the two states. This map is very hard to read because of the way it was printed. But it does show, it's simple if we get a different map, one of the different topo maps for the different years, then you can begin to see some of the land around the area. And you can tell that Nutrios, I'm using examples of very, very small and very, very obscure little places, because that's where we would be looking and being used the maximum use out of these topo maps. So this is the 1981 topo map. And so it helps to look at all the different ones to see the difference. Now, if I search for cemetery or church on Google Maps, and there's the highway with the yellow squiggles. And then you have the Nutrioso Cemetery that's out there on the end of a dirt road. And so there's the cemetery, and I can zoom in and have a look at the actual part of the land where the cemetery is. But if I go to a different map, this is a 2018, there's another cemetery that's not on the current map. And I'm not sure, but I don't think it was on any of the maps. And so here we have a cemetery that shows up only on this 2018 map. Understanding that each of these maps was made separately by different surveying companies and different surveying government people. And so there's going to be different information. And by looking through the maps, you may find things that you're not really going to be able to find in any other way. It's just not there unless you're looking for it. And so here we are showing Maxwell Cemetery. Now, if I zoom in on Google Earth, it actually did come up that marker. I don't mean Google Earth, I mean Google Maps. Then I would see that cemetery. But it was the topo that gave me the idea to go look for this. And that's a 2024 version of Google Maps. So now we have two Nutrioso Cemetery and the Rogers Cemetery. Well, here's another one. So now we've gone to a satellite view and searched for cemeteries, and I found another one, Rogers Cemetery, just south of town, and the Nutrioso Cemetery that we knew about, and the church. And there's also not the Maxwell Cemetery. So this is an interesting way. I think the illustration here you should understand that the only reason that we're finding some of this obscure information is because I'm using a series of maps. I'm using topo maps starting in the 1800s all the way till the 2020s. And so I'm using all those maps. Plus, I'm using Google Maps and Google Earth to give me additional information that I can see in the satellite that I can't see on the topo map. But I'm also getting information from the topo map that I can't see on the satellite view. So it takes a combination of these maps to find all the churches and cemeteries. And it also helps to know the history. And some of the cases when been doing this to look through the topo maps for churches, for example, I've been able to identify the closest church to the property owned by somebody's ancestor. And by looking at the church, we now have some additional records and able to follow the line. And we're productively finding information about the family. So here the admonition is to keep looking. As I've kind of explained here, there's some, I guess, homework you can have to begin to understand all the markings and everything on the topo maps. But once you understand that the tools that are available that can overlay these maps onto Google Earth are extremely powerful in ways. For example, their county boundaries. And if you go in and zoom in, you may find out that the county boundary goes right through your ancestors' property. And that could be the reason why there's some confusion about where the property is located. Okay. Well, thanks for watching.